Hello, welcome to my office. Come in, come in. I was just finishing up some grading. Have a seat, make yourself comfortable, and let's play a nice, cozy game of Go. Go is played by alternating stone placement on the cross sections of the board. You can play on any cross section you want, as long as there's some surrounding space. Go is a territory control game, but territory is kind of complicated if you don't know how the game works. So instead, we'll start with capturing. To capture stones, you have to play on all of the cross sections surrounding those stones, referred to as liberties. So to capture a single white stone, black has to play a stone on each of these 4 spots. If there are multiple stones next to each other, they share liberties with one another. So if there are 2 white stones next to each other, black has to play 6 surrounding stones to capture them. Stones on the sides and in the corners have fewer liberties because there are fewer spots surrounding them. So on the side, this black stone has 3 liberties, and in the corner, it only has 2. Now, normally, the only spaces you're not allowed to play on are those where your stone doesn't have any liberties, like here. Black can't play here, but if making a capture creates liberties, then it is legal now to play in that space, since your stone now has at least 1 liberty. That means if a white shape in the corner has only 1 empty space, where a black stone can't normally play, it can still be captured if black first surrounds the shape and then fills that eye space in the middle. What that means is that once this white shape has 2 separate empty eye spaces, then it's no longer possible for black to capture, since black would have to be able to play a stone in both spaces simultaneously. This is where the idea of territory comes in. Since this white shape can't be killed, that means white unequivocally controls that section of the board. There are a couple different methods of scoring we can use, but when I play on a physical board, I tend to use Japanese scoring since it's quicker to count, where this shape is worth 2 points, 1 for each of the empty spaces inside of the shape. 1 and 2. The game originated in Zhou Dynasty, China. The earliest known account refers to the game being played as early as the 6th century BCE, making it the oldest known game that's been continuously played to the present day. It became popular among the nobility and ruling class, and so was introduced to the Japanese and Korean ruling class around the 7th century CE, known in Korean as Badiou and in Japanese as Ego, or the shortened form we now also use in English, Go. In Mandarin Chinese, the game is called Weiqi, and I have no idea what the history of any of these terms is, especially considering the game is older than the Mandarin dialect. For most of its history, Go has been seen as a sophisticated pastime for gentlemen and scholars. It was so highly regarded that during the Tang Dynasty, it was one of the 4 arts that scholars serving as government officials were expected to be trained in, along with playing music, specifically the guqin, painting, and calligraphy. Naturally, it was considered an important object of study for both Confucian and Taoist scholars, and may even have played a significant role in their development. Go predates Confucianism by at least a century or 2. In fact, Confucius's writing is one of the earlier known references to Go in history. Confucian philosophy was primarily concerned with envisioning a harmonious society, and most of his method was personal cultivation at an individual level, that through teaching would proliferate through society. Basically, it was trickle-down education, but utopian. Taoism grew out of the school of naturalists, which is where most of the ideas in Taoist cosmology/metaphysics originate and largely emerged in reaction to Confucianism, seeing Confucianism as too rigid, hierarchical, and attached to tradition. Confucian and Taoist philosophers alike tended to regard Go very highly as a scholarly endeavor, especially during periods where literary and artistic endeavors were considered the epitome of scholarly practice. They found playing Go to be a form of truth-seeking, revealing introspective and philosophical insights through play. A game of Go, you see, is just like life, and life itself can be just like a game of Go. Playing these white and black stones in opposition conveys a surface-level kind of dualism. Like chess, we have two players who alternate placing stones onto the board with adversarial goals. We see most of the game's dualisms arise in the vast complexities of its dynamics of play, but before we get to that, this relationship between game pieces and the state of play is something I really like using as a metaphor to illustrate some fundamental ideas of Taoist philosophy. So you've probably at least heard about the idea of yin and yang. As soon as I say that, you've probably conceptualizing some adversarial relationship between good and evil locked in an eternal struggle. Stop it. That's not what this is. The concept is basically a way of dualizing ideas and things that exist. And that's about where its similarities end with the way it's popularly understood in Western consciousness. If I pick up this marker and ask you if the cap is on the left or the right, you'd probably tell me the cap is on the left. The marker has a left half and a right half, but to talk about the left side only makes sense with the context of having a right side. They aren't inherent to the object itself, but arise in our thinking about the object. And even though they exist in contrast with one another, they aren't ideas in conflict. There is a tension between them, but they are also interdependent on one another, inseparable and complementary. The relationship between the two ideas exhibits both of them in themselves. Now, if I ask you which side of the marker is the evil side, you'll probably want to call me a dumbass because that question doesn't fucking make sense. Okay, so I'm going to go down a tangent about why in our vague conception of Western culture, we have such a proclivity to misinterpreting yin and yang as referring to good versus evil. That comes from Manichaeism, which had a huge influence on Christian theology and its ideas on good and evil. Since that's been our dominant cultural paradigm, that's the origin of our most pervasive views of dualism. The words positive and negative have values-based connotations as compared to proton and electron, even though they're defined by having a positive and negative charge. It turns out to be really hard for us to use English without getting those value judgments as a side effect, because we instinctually assign moralistic values to any idea that we dichotomize. So naturally, Europeans reading about Taoist cosmology superimposed their own ideas about duality. And that's the interpretation that's been propagated, even though it's not the same thing. In addition to yin and yang, the other important concepts to Taoism are wuji and taiji. Wuji is formless. It precedes any kind of dichotomization or conceptualization, simultaneously empty and full. The basic translation is without polarity. There is only one thing which cannot be split, and that one thing is wuji, the absolute. Taiji emerges from wuji when it separates into polarities. The possibility for division exists, but has yet to be cut. Yin and yang are the expressions of taiji, where a knife is drawn to divide the poles from one another, and our many dualisms emerge. Returning to our game, we can think of the empty board as on the table like wuji. No pieces have yet been played, and we just have a board as it exists. Once we agree to play a game and bring in the colored stones, that's when taiji emerges from wuji. And when the game commences, with both players making their moves on the board, yin and yang are expressed upon the board. This expression of yin and yang in the play emerged through the dynamics of play. What makes Go as famous a game as it is, the reason it's stuck around as the longest continuously played game in human history, is that the elegant simplicity of its mechanics give rise to the unimaginably vast complexity of its dynamics. Since the goal of the game is to capture territory, there's a tension that players find between trying to expand and attack for more territory versus fortifying the territory they already control to defend it against the opponent. Stones tend to be stronger when they're placed closer to one another. So placing a stone next to another like this, referred to as an iron pillar, typically gives more stability than a one-space jump. But it's also pretty slow to expand outward, compared to a two-space jump or a knight's move. They're much quicker moves that do more to expand, but they don't have the same base of stability that an iron pillar does. That brings us to two of the most fundamental concepts in the game, cutting and connecting. If stones are played near one another, a connecting move will join white's pieces together here. A cutting move, on the other hand, does the exact opposite, so black can separate white's stones from each other. This is only barely scratching the surface of the game's dynamics, but already we're seeing these strategic dualisms emerge between offense and defense, speed and stability, and cutting and connecting. Yang is a push and yin is a pull. Yang moves forward and expands where yin contracts and pulls inward. That means yang is aggressive and violent, but yin is passive and yielding. On the other hand, yang is charitable and willing to give, but yin is greedy and takes for itself. This is why the terms yin and yang aren't value judgments like good and evil. They describe dichotomies, and our value judgments come after we separate ideas. Yin and yang are always relative to each other. If I draw a line here and put a dot on one side, my students drew these and I do not have the heart to erase them. We can clearly see that that dot is on the left side of the line, but if I make two dots, well, the first may be on the left side of the line, but it's further to the right than the second dot. Likewise, if I decide to erase half of the line, the remaining half still has a left and a right half. Yin and yang both contain each other because anything that we can split into halves can be further split into halves of halves. They can also trade places as contexts change. This marker has a left and right half, but that left and right depends on perspective. If we're facing each other, your left is my right. Likewise, if I turn the marker around, the side that was on your left is now on your right. In Go, sometimes it can be advantageous when your opponent is about to make a living shape to play either a throw-in stone or Nikade, both of which are plays where it will be captured inside of the opponent's territory. If white is able to play here, it can make two eyes. But if black can place a Nikade stone first, even though white can easily capture it, it's no longer possible for white to make more than one eye. Thus, black can kill these white stones from within. There's a similar situation called a snapback, where black can capture this white stone, but by making that capture, white can replace a stone at the same spot to capture black's whole group here. It's even possible, if too much of black's territory is left open here, for white to make life inside of black's territory. Obviously, this is not the only philosophy of dualism in the world. In fact, I've always found these ideas in Taoism to be surprisingly similar to Hegel's dialectics. He describes three moments forming a triadic structure that occur when exposed to an idea: the moment of understanding, the dialectical moment, and the speculative moment. The moment of understanding is when an idea appears stable, determined, maybe irrefutable. The dialectical moment is when an oppositional idea emerges. Faced with contradiction, prior certainty becomes unstable. The speculative moment reconciles the two into a unity of opposition. Put another way, his contemporary Johann Fichte referred to this dialectic using the terms thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Every idea is a thesis and has a logical opposite, its antithesis. The tension between the two can be integrated into a new idea which forms a synthesis. But the synthesis is an idea, a thesis in itself, and therefore has its own antithesis, which leads to forming yet another synthesis ad nauseum. There are a couple ways to look at the similarities with Taoism. First is that the moment of understanding is like Wuji, in that it's a state of fixity before subdivision into dualism. The dialectical moment occurs when a subdivision is made, as does Taiji, and the speculative moment navigates that subdivision as we see yin and yang doing. The other perspective is that a thesis and antithesis exist in contrast and are defined by one another as are yin and yang, even though they are part of the same whole, the synthesis. Hegel developed this dialectic in service of his philosophy of phenomenology. I think, look, I'm not gonna pretend like I actually understand Hegel because who the fuck even does anyway? Phenomenology is basically the philosophy of consciousness. What does it mean to be conscious? How do we interpret conscious experience? The grand idea in Hegel's phenomenology is totality, absolute knowledge, because only the whole is true. Everything else is just a subsection of truth. Another tension that players have to keep in mind while playing Go is between local and global play. If we're having a small fight and white is trying to capture a couple of black stones, that's all playing locally, but because a 19 by 19 board is so big, it's possible for the placement of stones elsewhere on the board to affect the strategies that are used over here. Maybe white manages to corner one of black's stones like this. Now, this is a powerful position for white called a ladder, since as a local play, black isn't able to escape. White can walk black all the way to the edge of the board here, but if black has another stone along this path, it gives black's stones a way to escape. This stone is typically called a ladder breaker. This idea of global play can be used to make threats in multiple places. If black plays a ladder breaker, white could typically respond by just capturing those stones. But black's ladder breaker might be placed in a way that threatens another group too. So if white does capture that ladder, they're leaving their other group exposed to an attack. Otherwise, if white defends that group, black's escape from the ladder turns white's highly advantageous position into one of severe disadvantage. In game studies, we have a pair of approaches for analyzing game systems. One which focuses on the structure of the game and rules in the abstract. The other that looks at how those systems are enacted in play and the experience of those rules. Proceduralism emerged from the early formalists of modern game studies and follows from the idea that we can construct meaning from the rules and operations of a game. That's the method we've been using up to this point to look at Go. But as Miguel Sicart argues in his influential paper Against Procedurality, proceduralism misses an important aspect of how we read meaning from games, which is that games get played. In the paper, he proposes a reinterpretation of the pre-existing term instrumental play, used in some slightly different contexts previously, to describe a mode of analysis where the experience of enacting a game, actually playing the damn thing, informs the meaning that we read out of it. When we consider that Go is a game played between people, that affects our reading of it as well because both people are bringing themselves, their values and their knowledge to the game. In the words of play scholar Bernie de Koven, there's a difference between playing to win and having to win. When the goal of play is to win, that shapes the way we engage in play. Even though wins and losses are built into the games we play by playing them, there must be a winner and loser. The win and loss is not necessarily what we're playing for. When we play for leisure, for the sake of play, winning might even be orthogonal to our desires, beside the point, worth ignoring. But even if that's the case, winning is still part of the context of the game we're playing. That's what informs what moves are good moves. Play allows us purposelessness. We play for the sake of it, for our own enjoyment of the activity. Winning gives a purpose to that purposelessness. And in a game that can be won, we can't separate those two things from each other. We can't engage purely for the sake of one without the other. Whatever our priorities are during a game, we generally find more enjoyment when a game is well played, when we each play with a degree of skill that consistently challenges the other. How much more interesting is a race that's neck and neck the whole time, both overtaking one another in turns throughout the whole race, than one in which the winner crosses the finish line in half the time of their opponent. Because of this, in some sense, by framing our play in competition, we work collaboratively to increase our enjoyment of the game. We should also consider here the contexts where we engage in play in the first place, sometimes for the sake of competition, entering a tournament to see how well you place, other times as an avenue for practice, to improve your skill at playing the game, but primarily as a site of social activity. I regularly have students stop by my office to play a quick game of Go, not because they care at all about the game itself, but mostly I think they're trying to use the game as an excuse to spend time with me outside the classroom. That context of socialization affects the way I approach the game. I'm not trying to make the most effective play as I can because that would be demoralizing. But if I am playing with someone who's genuinely interested in learning the game, I do tend to make some punishing moves more frequently because they're going to reveal more to my opponent about how the game works. Sometimes I'll even make a totally asinine move that I'd never play trying to win, just to mess with my opponent. Cyril, why would you play that move? I don't understand. Is there some weakness that I'm not seeing? Now I have to figure out what's going on here. It's just to fuck with you, because I think it's funny how much time you now have to spend thinking about a move that you don't even need to respond to. When I think about a move, playing against one of my students, I'm not just thinking about what the best moves are and where a skilled opponent would respond. I'm thinking about what moves would be enlightening about the game, which would be purposefully leaving a weakness open for them to take advantage of, which would be just absolutely rude to play, and which moves would be funny moves. All of this goes so far beyond mere win and loss, beyond mere optimal strategy, because there's so much more skill that's important to play than the skill of winning. When we think about the context surrounding the game being played, we're taking a step back from the system of the game to a system containing the game. And as we see, there are just as many dialectics surrounding the game as there are within the game. My favorite subfield of mathematics is set theory. Now, set theory encompasses things that we can do with a collection of objects. Sets contain objects. Those objects aren't necessarily numbers, even though they typically are in practice. We could have a set of drawings on my whiteboard, a set of marker colors in my hand, or a set of letters in the English alphabet, etc. The important characteristic of a set that's going to come up later is cardinality, the size of a set, the number of things that a set contains. So if we have the set containing the numbers 2, 3, 5, and 6, the cardinality would be 4, since there are 4 numbers in this set. It is possible for a set to have a cardinality of 0, a set which contains nothing. This is typically referred to as the empty set or the null set. There are other kinds of operations we can do, like unions and intersections. Basically, if we draw a Venn diagram of the two sets, the intersection gives us the overlapping area and the union gives us anything contained in either circle. If we have two sets, one containing 2, 5, and 6, and the other containing 5, 6, and 9, then the intersection would be 5 and 6, and the union would be 2, 5, 6, and 9. One of the powerful features of sets is that they can contain other sets. So we can also have a set containing 1, 2, and the set containing 1 and 2, which has a cardinality of 3. This is what allows us to have something called the power set, which contains all the subset permutations of a set. So the set containing x, y, and z would have a power set of all of this. I'm not even going to bother writing that. Alain Badiou uses set theory as a form of ontology. He postulates that a set is a multiplicity. We can take multiplicity to mean plenty of various things. I think it's productive for us to consider them as a multiplicity of ideas. Since a set can contain objects, ideas can be the objects which a set contains. Any object contained in a set might be atomic, not reducible into other objects, or it might be another set in itself, which can be further broken down into more objects contained within, which themselves might be more sets. Something really cool about set theory is that we don't actually need to have a definition for the objects contained in a set. We can just take for granted that they exist, so the rules or axioms of set theory don't have to define any objects. What that means, though, is that we don't have a definition for what numbers are. The only object that's defined within set theory is a set. One set, exactly one set specifically. That's the set that doesn't contain any objects, the null set. But since a set can contain another set, that means we can also have the set containing the empty set. The empty set, of course, has a cardinality of 0. So if we have a set containing that, then its cardinality would be 1. That's how we construct a definition of whole numbers within set theory. So 2 would be defined as the set containing the empty set and the set containing the empty set. This gets confusing very quickly. Another way we can think about the whole numbers is that each number is the successor of the previous whole number. So 4 is the successor of 3. So we can define a successor as being the cardinality of the power set of its predecessor. So 3 would be the power set of 2. What makes this so vital to Badiou's theory of ontology is the idea that we construct ideas from nothing. It's a different expression of an essential idea we've already established. Existence is defined by nothingness, and nothingness is defined by existence. Badiou takes this as a starting point to argue the impossibility of any kind of totalizing ideas, an idea so grand that it encompasses all other ideas. There can be no universal truth. Badiou takes this a step further by pulling in the infinities of set theory to reason that ontology can't be finite. When we start counting 0, 1, 2, skip a few, 99, 100, and skip a few more, there's not an upper bound on the numbers that we can count. So eventually we count up to infinity. This is what's referred to as an ordinal infinite, typically denoted using a lowercase omega. Ordinally infinite means that we can treat it like any other number on the number line, which means that there's another number that comes after it, infinity plus 1. Then we can have infinity plus 2 and infinity plus 3 and so on until eventually we get to infinity plus infinity and infinity times infinity. That just keeps getting bigger and bigger, so we put a little subscript next to the omega to show how much bigger one is than the others. But then that keeps getting bigger and bigger too. Why don't we just use an infinite subscript and then an infinite subscript with an infinite subscript? These are all numbers that we can enumerate in a set, listing them out. So if we start at 0 and count up through infinity, that would be the set of natural numbers. But if we wanted to talk about the cardinality of this set, how big would we say it is? We can't use omega to denote the size because we can clearly see that there are more numbers in the set than that. That's where the idea of cardinally infinite comes in. The cardinality of the set of natural numbers is Aleph null. Basically, every set that we can enumerate into a linear sequence has a size of Aleph null. So the set of integers and rational numbers, which include negatives and fractions, can be shown to have the same cardinality as the natural numbers. That's because they're all composed of discrete items, but other sets, like the real numbers, exist on a continuum. So in addition to 1 and 2, we also have everything in between them. and sets that include a continuum are bigger than Aleph null. How much bigger isn't really conclusive and actually is painfully complicated. Going back to the relationship between being and nothingness, this shows us that as soon as we have the possibility of being, it immediately blows up into the infinite. The set-theoretic definition for ordinal numbers is fairly similar to Hegel's conception of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. If every synthesis has its own antithesis, then we have an infinite possibility for synthesis. And we find the same ideas in Taoism. Chapter 42 of the Tao Te Ching begins, roughly translated, with the Tao gives rise to 1, 1 gives rise to 2, 2 gives rise to 3, and 3 gives rise to everything that exists. Based on that reasoning, my own conjecture is that in being able to have ideas, the variation in ideas we could have is infinite. It's obvious enough that, like the real numbers, ideas aren't enumerable. There's not a consistent approach we could take to listing out every idea that a human can have. Alternatively, an even more intuitive argument is that real numbers are a subset of ideas that we can have, just like the natural numbers are a subset of the real numbers. Every real number is an idea in itself that we could hold in our head. And there are a lot more ideas we can have than just numbers. That said, even though there is infinite variation in the ideas that we could think, there isn't in what we actually have the ability to think. Even though the natural numbers have an ordering in which they would be enumerated, what makes it infinite is that any practical attempt at doing so just isn't possible. Even though ideas are infinite, our capacity to hold them is not. Our minds are limited in what we are able to think. There will always be ideas and knowledge that will never be held in the mind of a human to think them. Everything we can think has limitations. Go is a finite game, but that doesn't mean we don't have to deal with the same set of limitations when we look at strategy. It's not a solved game, so we don't know everything there is to know about it. Solved games are those that we know optimal solutions for, such that, assuming optimal play, the winner can be predicted from any board state. Tic-tac-toe is a solved game, specifically what's referred to as a strongly solved game, which means that every possible dynamic and configuration has been mapped out. Not only do we know what plays have the best results from any board position, we know every possible outcome from any board state. We know everything there is to know about tic-tac-toe within the system of the game. This is not true for Go. It is a finite game. There is a boundary to the possible number of board states. Because it's finite, we know how the game could be solved given enough resources. Just like how we know the natural numbers could be enumerated. But the problem, again, is that we run into physical limitations of the resources available to us. Despite its finiteness, it's a similar problem to space travel. The next closest star to us after our sun is Proxima Centauri, which would take nearly 20,000 years to get to using current technology, and that one's only 4 light years away and some change compared to the ones that are hundreds of light years away. We know exactly, finitely, what their distance from us is, and yet, despite being finite, it still doesn't seem possible to reach them. I did a bunch of research into complexity theory to try and explain why Go is such a complicated game, but it turns out that just the basics of complexity theory would take way more time than I want to commit here, and I already spent way too much time on set theory. Instead, I'll leave you with the fun fact that the number of legal board states for a game of Go is more than the number of atoms in the known universe squared. And that barely begins to reveal the scale of complexity that this game operates at. For example, there are multiple ways to arrive at almost every one of those states. Even now, the cutting edge of AI technology is continuously improving its ability to play Go, and has arrived at a point where some of its reasoning about strategy is beyond interpretation by professional players. It further continues improving its ability the more resources that are afforded to it. And yet, there are not enough computing resources that can be spent on the problem for the game to be solved. That means there will always be limitations to the strategies and approaches we're able to use in play. Weaknesses for us to account for, improving one's skill is less about removing weaknesses and more about building an awareness of them. When you play, you pay attention to what weaknesses you have, how your opponent can take advantage of them, and if your opponent does so, how can you compensate for those limitations? Strong play is about knowing how to respond when your opponent tries to leverage those weaknesses, and sometimes turn a situation around if they make a mistake while doing so. This exchange came from a recent game that I played against a bot. At this point in the game, I knew that I was in a decent position on a lot of the board, but this section toward the edge had been cut off from my other groups. There was enough space that I might have been able to make life on the side, but I wasn't sure, so I left it for later, assuming it was probably going to be killed. As play continued, White decided that these two stones seemed vulnerable, so it went for an attack. By making its attack on one side, my response happened to make an opening on the other side. I didn't care much about losing those two stones, but by threatening that capture, White opened up a weakness somewhere else that I was able to take advantage of and make sure that the whole group was able to live. The most common advice given to new Go players is to lose your first 100 games as quickly as possible. It's pretty cheeky in pointing out the lack of skill that new players have, but the reason it's brought up so commonly is that when you're first starting out, you have no sense of what's a good move and what isn't. Even if you're carefully considering moves, you might as well be playing randomly. So really, the advice is to relinquish the idea of winning and focusing on building up a sense of patterns that start to emerge during play. That builds a base of understanding that can be built upon when studying the game. When you have that base of understanding, it's of course important to actively study the game and reason through various situations, but many players will talk about letting the game play you. This is a very Taoist way of thinking. That phrase refers to letting your intuition take the wheel and play on instinct. By letting intuition take over like this, that really focuses on building your intuition, which provides a starting point for consciously reasoning about moves. Even at a high-level play, professional players will always think pretty deeply about why they're making the moves that they do, but sometimes when asked, their response amounts to, "It felt right." So really, there's just as much skill in developing intuitive thinking about the game as there is in rational thinking about it. Not only that, but Go is often a surprisingly emotional game. I can't speak for everybody, but in my own experience, whenever I'm on the losing end of a big capture, I can feel the well of emotion shutting down my ability to think. The emotional qualia is so consuming that it's difficult to focus on anything else, or maybe that's just my neurodivergent ass brain. That's true whether or not it was a big enough capture to be game altering, and they're often marginal enough that if I continue to play well, it's still possible to win the match. Resignation from a game isn't so much a statement of you have won as much as it is I have lost. And that distinction comes down to a willingness to continue, because it's so easy to drown in that emotion and let it overwhelm your ability to think about a game. I found this to be a useful exercise for learning how to deal with that kind of emotional setback in life, how to press through it instead of shutting down in response. On a practical level, the way I've worked through that response is rather than trying to shut out the emotional mind and focus solely on the rational, instead, I learned to focus on them both simultaneously, holding space for the emotion without letting it block out the reason. It forced me to see how the rational and the emotional are interconnected with one another. These kinds of hang-ups in play are what Robert Pirsig refers to as gumption traps in his novel Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Gumption, as Pirsig puts it, is the psychic gasoline that keeps the whole thing going. And gumption traps essentially are situations that impede progress and willingness to continue in a task. You're playing a video game, make a bunch of progress without saving your game, and suddenly all the progress is erased, forcing you to start over. Frustrating situation. You put the game down and never pick it up again. Or maybe it takes you a few months before returning to it. That's a gumption trap because it's impacted your willingness to continue in this endeavor. Pirsig discusses a few different kinds of gumption traps based on different features of the trap. This example is what he refers to as a setback because it's caused by external factors. The ones we talked about in Go are different kinds of value traps. The emotional hang-up comes from a hit to the ego. Since captures feel like an indication that you've played poorly, they aren't necessarily, but that's the only heuristic that's recognizable at a low level. You are being shown that you messed up, and you can't turn away from that mistake. On the other hand, a first-time player staring blankly at the board trying to figure out what moves would even be sensible is hitting the same kind of trap from anxiety. You want to be able to play well, so if you can think hard enough about what you're doing, you'll eventually be able to shit out a half-decent move, right? Except that more time spent thinking about individual moves doesn't really lend itself to further insight. Instead, it's usually just the same handful of thoughts cycling through each other. That's why losing your first 100 games quickly is such good advice. It gives new players space to accept that they don't know what they're doing and just throw themselves at a wall until they figure it out. The novel is written to be a work of practical philosophy. It uses metaphors of motorcycle maintenance and road trips so that you can touch the philosophy. The reason this book is worth mentioning here is that most of the discussions in the book incorporate a very relevant intellectual tool. Phaedrus's analytical knife, a blade which cuts ideas into equal and opposite halves. Art and science, subject and object, abstract and concrete, and, most frequently referenced throughout the novel, classical and romantic ways of thinking. I'd go into more detail, but really, the whole video so far has been an exercise in using that knife. I did mention this book to be a work of practical philosophy, so I'd be remiss not to discuss why the knife was so useful to Phaedrus in the novel. Phaedrus's ultimate goal was trying to determine how we know what is good or quality, both in the ethical and moral sense of being antithetical to evil, as well as the aesthetic sense of things that we like. The instigating question for him essentially came down to whether quality is subjective or objective. We all recognize that there is a matter of personal taste involved, which is subjective, but we typically have a lot of consensus and agreement despite matters of taste, which would imply some level of objectivity. The problem he ran into was that neither really seemed sensible, as they both raised just as many problems as the other. If it's objective, then quality should be objectively verifiable, and it's just not something we would be able to measure. On the other hand, if it's subjective, then any matter of discussion about quality would be purely anarchic, so deeply trivialized as to not even be worth talking about. When playing games like Go, we would typically say that a strategy is good if it wins games. That's close enough to empirical support, but why is winning good? That doesn't strike me as something that would be very objective, and yet you'd be pretty hard-pressed to find someone who doesn't want to win games when they play. However, all that comes down to the fact that a player, the subject, is motivated to win, and that win comes down to a personal enjoyment. Among the thinkers Phaedrus found himself looking for answers was Hegel, with his concept of an absolute mind that was independent of objectivity and subjectivity. The thesis and antithesis couldn't be correct on their own. and the only way to find truth was in a synthesis between them. We cut things into these dualisms, dichotomies, and dialectics because we can't understand things in their entirety as they exist. So we find ways to break them down into smaller, bite-sized chunks. I can put this into my mouth. Dividing things into conceptual halves is a natural way to go about that subdivision. That's exactly the purpose of Phaedrus's knife and the reason I love it so much as an analytical tool. But this points us to the limitations of dualistic thinking. By severing an idea into halves, both halves are less than the whole. When considering objectivity and subjectivity, Phaedrus rejected both positions. Quality is not objective, and it is not subjective. He determined instead that it must be found in the relationship between subject and object. That idea of positionality, the relationship between the two, is vital to whatever ways we dichotomize ideas. Phaedrus's knife is most useful when it's used to look at the relationship between the halves that it's cut, not when it discards one of the halves. And we can use it to cut whatever kinds of conceptual halves we want to. That's why I don't really believe in neutrality, because to find a neutral position between two sides, you have to consider those sides in isolation. And that veneer of neutrality falls apart when we scrutinize the relationship between those two halves, and other ways we could have used the analytical knife to cut different halves. That's also one of the major critiques of Hegel's dialectic, because thesis-antithesis positions opposing ideals as necessarily equal to one another, and they just aren't. Otherwise, Go would always end in a draw. Most of the philosophy I've gone through in this essay, with the exception of Badiou, are actually forms of monism, which refers to philosophies that insist on some manner of absolute oneness. More specifically, they're dialectical monism, which asserts that the whole is understood in the way it's divided into dualisms. That's what Wuji and Taiji are in Taoism. That's the totality in Hegel's philosophy that we can only know subsections of. And that's what Phaedrus came to see quality as, which he could only interrogate by cutting it with his knife. We can't know the totality of the whole in the same way that we can't play a perfect game of Go. That's why play is a kind of truth-seeking, why it was so highly valued by scholars in early recorded history. We have written works on the philosophical aspects of Go that far predate and outnumber the kinds of technical writing that saturates the Go landscape today. By playing a game of Go, we are helping each other uncover truth about this game, and in some sense, about life itself. When we play Go, we're exploring how the game works, what moves are effective and why, but we also map all sorts of strategic ideas onto the stones that we play, both as individual moves and as shapes and patterns that emerge on the board. Just like we map these abstract ideas of strategy onto the concrete physicality of the board in front of us. It's natural to further abstract the ideas we're mapping into the realm of philosophy and living well. The act of play focuses our attention to thinking about ideas that matter to the game. So of course, that's going to be strategy. And the more abstract and complex we're able to consider strategy, the more complex of ideas we'll consider along with that strategy. Play is what we use to poke the boundaries of understanding. We can, of course, do that with any activity like archery or motorcycle maintenance, but the way we think about that activity shapes the insights that we draw from it. Go really lends itself in its structure and dynamics to the kind of dialectical thinking that we've covered here. In Go, we find the same tensions that we have to contend with throughout the rest of our lives, the limitations of humanness. In our relationships, we strive to make deeper connections with one another and avoid doing harm. But no matter how much we try to avoid it, there will always be friction and hurt in those relationships. We should prioritize our ability to not harm each other, but it's just about as important to respond well to harm that has been done. And the way we structure our society and communities, we want everyone to be able to live well, but there are always needs and values of community members that will be in conflict with each other. We should work towards structures that benefit everybody and limit those conflicts, but we also have to find strategies for resolving them when they inevitably happen. Even in our ideas, we cannot find a perfect understanding of the world around us. Every idea and value that we can hold has limitations and is deserving of criticism, because those criticisms help us improve our ideas and better shape our understanding and existence in the world for us and for everyone around us. Just like how being aware of the weaknesses and strategies help improve our play of a game. We cannot fully grasp truth. We can only contend with its bits and pieces. Go is a distillation of the constraints on the very reality we inhabit, and by playing Go, we force ourselves to come face to face with those limitations on our psyche. What is a life well lived but a series of games well played?